Wait.
Okay, welcome everyone to this second webinar in our free webinar series, kicking off our Summer of Learning. We are extremely excited to welcome you to this session on how to ungrade. I am Homa Tavangar, and I am joined by my co-founder of the Big Questions Institute and good friend, Will Richardson. And we are delighted to welcome our good friend, Jessie Stommel, for what we know is going to be a mind-blowing, enlightening hour, less than an hour. We promised 45 minutes, but I hope you set aside an hour because you're going to want it. To learn about ungrading, to learn about so much more than assessment. And we are particularly excited because today is actually our sort of 1-year anniversary of the Big Questions Institute. The Big Questions Institute was actually started as sort of a humble workshop in November of 2019. But after the pandemic, we decided that there is so much learning that has to happen, and we are on a steep learning curve, and we want to share that learning with our friends, colleagues, educators around the world. And so in June of 2020, we launched our first event, which was actually a free webinar, and we had over 1,000 people at that one, and we just continue to grow. We're on to something. And friends like Jessie help us to grow that idea. So I don't want to take up too much time with this intro, but we are absolutely thrilled. And we're going to talk a little bit more about what we have coming up. But today's session is the kickoff for a phenomenal series, including many other friends and thought leaders in a summer of learning. So this 5-workshop series that is coming up today is, as we said, it's the first one. Let's see. Okay, so this is really exciting too. We want to share with you since it is our anniversary. We have over 1,600 people that, as far as we know, that have signed up for this webinar. And, that is just such a sign of the community that is growing around the world. Word is spreading. We want people to join. We want to give away as much as we can. We're giving away our book on the 9 big questions. You can download it at bigquestions.institute. And we're just thrilled to have you join us. And I'm going to turn it over to Will to introduce Jessie more formally.
And we need to thank Homa for stepping out of her daughter's graduation party to just welcome everyone. Thank you, Homa, and what a beautiful background that is. Yeah, so 1,600 people. And I mean, to me, that says that this topic of ungrading is one that is on a lot of people's minds. And obviously, the last 16 months or so, with everything that's happened, has surfaced so many questions about education, and this is definitely one of them. And so it's a real treat to get a chance to just listen to someone who has been thinking about this for a long time and who I think has some pretty brilliant perspectives on how we can not only kind of position or think about assessments differently, but also then begin to actually practice assessments differently in the classroom. So without further ado, let me just introduce Jessie very briefly. He is the co-founder of the Digital Pedagogy Lab and Hybrid Pedagogy, the Journal of Critical Digital Pedagogy. He has a PhD from University of Colorado Boulder. And I said this in the 12 p.m. session too, but he's co-written a couple of books that have truly influenced the way that I think about teaching a great deal. And they are especially relevant in this moment when we have been, in many cases, forced to move into these online learning environments. Some of us have been there for quite a long time, but for a lot of schools, this last year or so has been this bumpy ride in terms of how do we begin to think differently about our craft in an online environment. And so these 2 books, An Urgency of Teachers, The Work of Critical Digital Pedagogy, and Critical Digital Pedagogy, a collection. They're both free for PDF download, and you can also purchase them to support his work with his co-authors on Amazon and other places. But they are awesome, and they will continue to make you think even past this session, which I know is going to be thought-provoking. So Jesse is at jessestommel.com, and you can follow him on Twitter at Jessifer. And without further ado, Jesse, thanks so much again for your willingness to do this session as well as the one earlier today, and really looking forward to working with you down the road.
Thank you so much, Will and Homa. Honestly, the idea that we need community to do this work is so incredibly important to me. And ultimately, that is why I'm here. And that is why, I don't know, that's what gets me up in the morning when it comes to doing this work of teaching. Teaching can feel so isolating at certain points. And so being able to have collaborators and being able to have fellow teachers who I work with and figure this all out with is crucial. So when the pandemic pivot happened, I, within several weeks, launched what I called open office hours with my colleague, Sean Michael Morris. And what we didn't know exactly what they were for when we launched them. We ended up holding them for a year, every week or every other week across the entire first year of the pandemic. And ultimately, the goal of these office hours was to give faculty and teachers, both in K-12 and higher education, a space to talk through our present moment. And I remember early on in one of those sessions, someone said the words, "If this is what teaching continues to look like, I'm not sure if I want to be a teacher anymore." Those words have stuck with me since that conversation, and I can't get them out of my brain. Ultimately, that series of conversations was exactly about figuring out how we continue to do this work in the midst of our present moment. It wasn't, and when that was said, and the way that we took it as a group, it wasn't a moment of defeat. It was a moment instead of figuring out, well, if that's how we feel right now, we have to figure out a way to move forward. And ultimately, the way that we do that is by working together. So truthfully, I'm excited to have this conversation with you all. I'm excited to work with Will and Homa in the future and through this series. Let me go ahead and share my slides and get started. So my talk today is called Ungrading an Introduction. I will say that I have hesitated to give this particular talk, and I've hesitated for a long time. And the reason is because I feel like the way that we assess, the way that we grade is so incredibly idiosyncratic. And it's so crucial to how we approach the work that we do as teachers. I first wrote a blog post called Why I Don't Grade in 2017. And I have not graded since I began teaching 21 years ago, 1999. And it took me quite a while to start to write about this publicly. The reason I did was because I felt like we were at a moment. We were at a moment where we needed to have critical conversations about grades and assessment, because I had hit a point in my own teaching where I felt like grades and assessment were a wave that was washing over the work that I was doing. And in some ways, it was a torrent that I couldn't feel like I could get out of in some ways. So I began to talk about and write about my ungrading practice. I'm going to go ahead and give you the thesis of this particular talk right now, and it's right here on the screen. Ungrading means raising an eyebrow at grades as a systemic practice, distinct from simply not grading. The word is a present participle, an ongoing process not a static set of principles. So one of the things I've resisted from the beginning, and I've been asked many times, what are your top 10 things that a teacher should do in order to dive into the work of ungrading? Or what are the best practices in this work? And ultimately, I always push back on the notion of best practices because I feel like the work of teaching is incredibly idiosyncratic. Every teacher shows up to a classroom, a different classroom with a different group of students having a different embodied experience of the work of teaching and learning. And so ultimately, best practices are something I push back on, because instead of best practices, I think what we need is something like best in your context with your group of students at your institution, in your geographical context, in your embodied experience of the work of teaching practices. And to acknowledge the fact that what works for me might not necessarily work for you. So this is not going to be the talk where I tell you exactly what you should do tomorrow in order to completely change and revolutionize your teaching practices. On the other hand, I will also tell you that at the end of this talk, I have 4 things that you can do tomorrow in order to dive into and start to do the work of ungrading. I will hint at that and tell you that most of those are about probing our own pedagogies, not me proselytizing about my pedagogy, but about helping us all find the best possible approach that will work for us in our context. So the pivot. I will tell you honestly, the first second that I heard this word pivot, it made the hairs go up on the back of my neck. I couldn't, from the very start, and I didn't know why at first. I didn't know why I couldn't stand the word pivot, but I will tell you that it made me anxious and it caused me ire. I've continued to feel ire at this word pivot, and partly the reason why the word pivot is problematic for me is because what pivots? To turn on or as if on a pivot. So I looked the word up and I thought about what it is. Ultimately, a pivot is a specific mechanical object that's designed to affect the turn one way and then the turn the other way. And ultimately, I looked around at the work that we were doing in education, both higher education and K-12, and I actually didn't see this mechanical object, this pivot, having been invented for us for this specific moment. None of us were prepared for the pandemic. None of us were prepared for this so-called pivot. For me, desk chairs pivot. They pivot one way and then they just as neat and tidily pivot back the other direction. So this is my other problem with the word pivot, is that it suggests that we can turn one direction and then just as easily at the end of the pandemic, the so-called end of the pandemic, we can just as neat and tidily pivot back to business as usual. This hasn't been my experience of the last 18 months, and it isn't my experience of the present moment. I don't see myself, I'm vaccinated. Suddenly I'm finding myself in restaurants after 18 months of having never been in a restaurant. Suddenly I'm imagining being able to walk into a physical classroom. I haven't been in a physical classroom for 18 months. I'm imagining myself being able to be in a physical classroom, but I'm not imagining everything back business as usual. I'm imagining instead that all of us have to take the last 18 months and what we've learned in the last 18 months, what we've seen in the last 18 months, what we've learned about ourselves as teachers and what we've learned about our students. We have to take all of that information and change the work that we do with our students. I've argued here and I've argued elsewhere that the students struggling most during the pandemic were the students most likely to have been struggling prior to the pandemic. Ultimately, what we have to do is recognize that we can't stop acknowledging and recognizing the acute chronic trauma our students face, the struggles that they face. And I guess what I'll argue about our grading and assessment structures is that they weren't designed to comprehend or help us grapple with a moment like the one that we're currently dealing with. I remember lots of debate at the beginning of the pandemic about how we would address grades in the spring, and then in the fall, and then in the following spring. And there was discussion about pass-fail options. I proposed at one point, why wouldn't we just give all of our students A's? This present moment does not give us the ability to objectively quantify student work. I guess what I would also argue is that if if we think about something like the invention of compassionate grading policies in the midst of a pandemic, why, when we know that so many of our students were struggling prior to the pandemic and will continue struggling after the pandemic, why aren't we thinking about compassionate grading policies that continue perpetually? If your institution just continued grading during the pandemic, business as usual, here's what all those grades were measuring: how well students and teachers pivoted to online, whether students had necessary access and support at home, the ability of students to perform in a crisis. What all those grades mostly weren't measuring: student learning and/or content knowledge. And I will say, not many of us succeeded at pivoting to online. Not many of us succeeded at finding all the necessary access and support we needed at home. Not many of us succeeded at performing well in a crisis. And the thing is that these crises weren't just the pandemic, but all of the things we were experiencing prior to the pandemic, increased by the intensity of this moment. Deciding to ungrade has to come from somewhere, has to be more than ring a bell. It has to have pedagogical purpose and to be part of a larger picture of how and why we teach. So I guess what I hope that we take away from this moment, and what we take away from the increased sort of fervor around the conversation about ungrading, a really important push on how our institutions do quote unquote business as usual. What I hope that we take away from this is a recognition that we have to rethink who we are in a classroom. And we have to rethink how we engage with the students that we work with in our classrooms. And we also have to find out more about our students. We have to find out more about how they're struggling now, what challenges they face. We have to find out more about what successes they've experienced. And we also have to find out more about what they're afraid of, what they're excited about. I don't ultimately think grades help us do those things. So when I give workshops about grades and assessment, I usually start with some foundational questions. Questions like, who is assessment for? What's the difference between grading and feedback? How do we grade? What would happen if we didn't grade? Ultimately, for me, the question in here that often gets the most discussion is this question under number 3 here. How do we grade? How does it feel to be graded? What do we want grading to do or not do in our classes for students or teachers? I ask students, how does it feel to be graded? I ask teachers, how does it feel to be graded? I ask teachers, how does it feel to do the work of grading? Usually the discussion can go on, like I can ask that question in a workshop, and if I've got 2 hours planned, we can often spend 45 to 50 minutes just talking about this one question. And I think that's because there's a lot of feeling attached to the work of grading. There's a lot of feeling attached to being graded. Often students talk about how when they are graded, they don't feel like it's their work being graded, but they feel like it's them as human beings that are being graded. And often when I talk to teachers, they talk about how their entire pedagogy, their entire self as a teacher gets bound up in whether or not they are grading successfully, whether they're grading up to their own standards, up to the standards of their institution. There's a lot of anxiety that I hear when I hear people talk about grades. And ultimately, I sort of feel the second that I start to see that kind of anxiety, I feel like it's something that we need to deal with, something that we need to talk about. However, I'll also say that ungrading, again, is not about putting grades off the table. It's not about not grading, because ultimately we all walk into a classroom having worked and having learned in a system where grading was perpetual. In some cases, where grading at the very least felt perpetual. So even when we walk into a classroom where grades are being rethought, where grades are being reimagined, we still bring all of that thinking, all of those previous struggles, all of that trauma that we might have associated with grading and being graded into that classroom. So it's not like we can just snap our fingers and say, well, we won't grade, and therefore we will feel no anxiety about grading. The truth is that most examples of grading, ungrading come with a certain amount of anxiety because we're worried. We're worried about performance. We're worried about how people are perceiving our performance. We've been set up and conditioned to think about those things. Assessment tends so much to drive and control teaching. Much of what we do in the classroom is determined by the assessment structures we work under. Ultimately, I want us to think about not designing our pedagogies or designing our curricula or designing our courses as a response to the necessary approaches to assessment that we imagine are required, that might be required by our institutions. But instead, I want us to think about, how do we craft our teaching? How do we design the relationships that we want to have with students? How do we think about structuring an environment that supports those relationships? And then what kinds of assessment will help us work within those spaces? Ranking, metrics, norming, objectivity, uniformity, accreditation, measurement, rubrics, outcomes, quality, data, performance, averages, excellence, curves, inflation, mastery, standardization, rigor. I put so many words in this slide in part because I want myself to feel exhausted by the time that I finish reading it, because these things are affecting how we engage with students, how we engage with one another, how we structure course plans, how we structure syllabi, how we design for the work that we're going to do with students. These are the things that enter into every classroom we walk into. And these are the things that I hear administrators using. If I hear a talk from an administrator, and it isn't like that an administrator is attempting to do harm, I will hear these words dropped with not a lot of nuance. And nevertheless, the words will affect and impact how I structure my work. These words are things that condition us, that force us to think about how we do our work in different ways. They're words that structure our institutions. I would argue grading by any of our conventional academic metrics undermines the work. Grades are not good incentive. Grades are not good feedback. Grades encourage competitiveness over collaboration. Grades are not good markers of learning. Grades don't reflect the idiosyncratic, subjective, emotional character of learning. Grades aren't fair. I feel like I could spend an entire webinar on that word fair, because that word fair comes up a lot when I give talks about grading. And it comes up a lot because, again, we're conditioned to think that the role of grades is to rank students against one another. So within a system of ranking, fairness would be necessary. If I was using the exact same measurement with one person, I should be using that exact same measurement with another person, if and only if I was holding those two people up to one another, comparing them, expecting them to succeed in the same ways at the same time at the same rate. If instead I think about students as idiosyncratic, I think about my work as idiosyncratic, all of a sudden fairness, it's not that there isn't fairness within that system. It's that fairness means something altogether different. Fairness means how well have I understood a specific student's circumstances before I tried to quantify their performance? Have I adequately understood their circumstances? Not, have I equally and efficiently and neat and tidily measured everyone's performance by the same metric? I'm seeing questions flurry through in the chat. There's all kinds of questions here that I want to talk about at more length. One question here about teaching a group of 150 students each semester in a writing intensive course. Immediately, my brain starts to think, wow, writing intensive, 150 students. How do we manage that obstacle? And it isn't that I immediately think, well, we should never have 150 students in a writing intensive course. It's that that question forces me to think, what is writing for? What is a course for? And instantly, when I see a question like that, I think, and I'm going to talk about this a bit later, I think about what the role of the instructor is. Is the role of the instructor to stage and organize an experience for students and the instructor? Or is the role of instructor to evaluate and rank every single student? all of a sudden, when you've got 150 students, if your role is to organize, rank, evaluate, and offer feedback to every single student, it feels almost overwhelming to imagine doing a writing intensive course with 150 students. If we think about our roles differently as structuring an experience for students, structuring an experience for students where they're not just getting feedback from us, but they're also getting and giving feedback from and to each other, where they're getting feedback from authentic audiences. All of a sudden, we can think of assessment in a different way as something that is not just in the purview of the instructor, but assessment is actually something that the responsibility of assessment is on the entire community and not just the person who is perceived as being at the head of that community. And there's a question also about labor-based grading, and I will definitely talk about labor-based grading in a moment. Historically, grades are more of an anomaly than anything else. They are a very recent technology. Prior to the late 1700s, performance and feedback systems in education were incredibly idiosyncratic. The first official record of a grading system was from Yale in 1785. Throughout the 19th century, they became increasingly comparative, numerical, and standardized. The A to F system appears to have emerged in 1898, with the E not disappearing until the 1930s. And the 100-point or percentage scale became common in the early 1900s. Letter grades were not widely used until the 1940s. Even by 1971, only 67% of primary and secondary schools in the US were using letter grades. An objective system for grading was created so systematized schooling could scale. And we've designed technological tools in the 20th and 21st century that have allowed us to scale further toward standardization and away from subjectivity, human relationships, and care. I see a lot of eliding of this history to point to industrialization as somehow fundamentally changing education and the way that we do grading and assessment within education, the way that we organize classrooms, the way that we architect learning spaces. And yet I think it's more complicated than just saying that there's this one moment in history where there was this fundamental transformation. Ultimately, there's something very different about the industrialized classroom and the one-room schoolhouse. There is something fundamentally different about how learning happens in those spaces, how assessment happens in those spaces. On the other hand, this isn't a single moment in time where there was a sudden shift or transformation. There's a long history here and a history that we have to unpack and suss out. When I look at stuff like this, when I look and think about this history, one thing I also want to point out is that this present pushback on grades is also not new. There is, alongside the history of grades, which is relatively brief, 200 years ago, grades in their current incarnation were invented, and only in the last 60 years were they popularized. At every moment, there is also significant pushback on grades. And that's important to note because this moment of ungrading, this fervor of this present moment and pushback on grades isn't particularly new. There's also a history of pushback and pressure on traditional grades. If you think about John Dewey and Evelyn Dewey in the 20s, if you think about Emerson in the 19th century, and then you think about Peter Elbow, Paulo Freire, in the 60s, the 70s, the 80s. There's been a significant pushback on grades for as long as grades have been around. The grade takes the complexity of human interaction within a learning environment and makes it machine readable. A/A-, A-/B+, F+. I don't think anyone has actually gotten an F+. I leave that in this slide. I'm not sure why, partly because I wonder if that grade has ever existed or has ever been given. 97%, 59%, 18 out of 20, 10 out of 20, high first, low 2-1. And so one thing I want to point out is that grades are also idiosyncratic. One thing that's true across systems is that these quantitative metrics tend to be relatively arbitrary, but they don't necessarily all fit and conform to A/A-, A-/B+. There's lots of different systems geographically, internationally. One thing that I think about when I look at these grades is the degree to which so many of these feel deeply, deeply arbitrary. I'm not sure what an A-/A equals. What happens if the A is before the A-? What happens if the A- is before the A? There's something very idiosyncratic about how we do this work of grading. The strangest grade that I ever got was an A-, and I'm still befuddled by that grade to this day. Another grade that I think is really bizarre is the D. Within the US system, the D is a very, very strange grade. Oftentimes Ds don't transfer, they don't count, and yet there are often ways that an F can be overwritten by something else. So the D exists in this liminal space where it doesn't quite count for anything, and it also doesn't quite represent failure. And I have actually determined in my teaching to never give Ds because I think it's a very, very odd grade. Doesn't communicate anything to students and often is an extraordinarily bureaucratic hurdle or strange space for students. Research shows 3 reliable effects when students are graded. They tend to think less deeply, avoid taking risks, and lose interest in learning itself. In Pedagogy of the Oppressed, Paulo Freire argues against the banking model of education, an active depositing in which the students are the depositories and the teacher is the depositor. In place of the banking model, Freire advocates for problem-posing education, in which a classroom or learning environment becomes a space for asking questions, a space of cognition, not information. I'm extraordinarily influenced by critical pedagogy as a movement. Folks like Henry Giroux, Paulo Freire, bell hooks. And Paulo Freire writes about his desire to help students read their world, to help students think critically about the world that they live in, their material circumstances, and give them the tools that they need to push back on those material circumstances, to give them the tools that they need to do more than just read their world, but to affect change within their world. I am inspired by that in my thinking about grades, because I think what we need to do more than anything is think critically about grades ourselves, push back on systems that oppress students and oppress us as teachers, and also give our fellow teachers, ourselves, and students the tools that they need in order to take ownership of their own learning, and to give teachers the tools that they need to take ownership of their own teaching. My thesis over the last few years has been this: start by trusting students. In some ways, I run all of the other pedagogical work I do against these 4 words. 4 years ago, I did an exercise called #ForwardPedagogy, where I invited people to try and capture their pedagogical thinking, their pedagogical work, their pedagogical philosophies in 4 words. I was inspired by the idea of a 6-word story where you can contain an entire narrative inside 6 words. Sometimes thinking with constraints helps us find the heart of what we do, the heart of the story, the heart of our pedagogies. In some ways, when I did this, I thought this would just be a one-off. This would just be a strange little exercise that would get us thinking and spark some conversation. It actually inspired thousands, something like 4,500 responses. And some of the responses have stuck with me to this day. So this is my first forward pedagogy: start by trusting students. And it has remained in some ways the thesis for so much of the work that I've done. Another one that I really admired was by my colleague Maha Bali, and she wrote, "Love first, design later." And I loved the sort of turn. I loved the way that she turned. Oftentimes design is done before we meet students. So much of our design of curricula, our design of courses is done well in advance of meeting our students. And we might design for love. But what she was asking for us to do is think about who our students are and let that impact the design. And she was also talking about meeting our students sort of certainly philosophically where they are, but I think also genuinely meeting our students and designing with them and not just for them. Ultimately, this is something I think we need to do with assessment. Don't design assessment for students, but think about how we can design assessment and the way that we use grades with students. Conventional grading is often at odds with our institutional missions. So far, I haven't seen a school mission statement with any of these. We pit students and teachers against one another. We rank students in competitive ways. We measure output with little concern for the learning process. We value extrinsic over intrinsic motivation. We start from a place of deep suspicion of students. We assess in ways that reinforce bias against marginalized students. And yet, while so much of the research points to the fact that intrinsic motivation benefits learning far more than extrinsic motivation, so many of our systems are built around extrinsic motivation. And so, yet, nevertheless, so many of our mission statements and what we say we do doesn't necessarily line up with what we actually do at institutions of education. One thing I want to point out here is that I'm talking a lot about who our students are at this particular moment, their material circumstances, the self that they bring to the work that they do with us in classrooms. I'm also talking about the selves that we bring as teachers to the classroom. I think it's important for us also to think about educational history and how that history has impacted not just our students, but also us. We are products of the educational system that we are trying to work within. And what has that educational system done to us as human beings? Black girls are 12 times more likely than their white counterparts to be suspended. This is data from a piece from Time magazine by Soraya Shimali called "All Teachers Should Be Trained to Overcome Their Hidden Biases." While Black children make up less than 20% of preschoolers, they make up more than half of out-of-school suspensions. I always find myself somewhat taken aback by this particular piece of data. I have a 4-year-old, she's Black. She's entering preschool after 18 months of being away from school during the pandemic. And I see this data and I think, well, wait a minute. Preschoolers suspended? Is that something that even happens? And I think it's important to point out that my shock and my surprise is a point of privilege. I am shocked and surprised because I experienced preschool within a white male cis body. And the experience that my daughter will have at preschool will be markedly different. And so recognizing that our own shock and surprise at this data is something that we need to contend with and something that we need to think through and think with. Teachers spend up to 2/3 of their time talking to male students. They also are more likely to interrupt girls. When teachers ask questions, they direct their gaze towards boys more often, especially when questions are open-ended. And this data has been repeated with college-age students as well. This is a meta-analysis of bias and grading, where the ultimate findings are that the results suggest that bias can occur in subjective grading when graders are aware of irrelevant information about students. This meta-analysis includes data from 20 studies of 1,935 graders. The authors ultimately suggest blind grading, but I'd argue race, gender, and ability do not constitute irrelevant information. We can't counter bias by ignoring it. Who our students are is exactly relevant, and their specific challenges need to be accounted for in our approach to assessment. When we are designing assessment, we have to remember that our students might be that preschooler, that Black girl preschooler who was suspended. Food insecurity is a significant factor in determining the average math SAT score. An increase in food insecurity lowers the students' math SAT scores. So when we're doing high stakes testing, when we're grading in traditional quantitative ways, what are we actually measuring? Are we measuring a student's aptitude? Are we measuring their learning? Are we measuring their ability? Or are we measuring other factors that are influenced by bias that's baked into our system? Osterk et al. Found that students perform more poorly on exams when they are several weeks removed from receiving food stamp benefits. So it's not just whether students are food insecure or not that we might be measuring for with our high stakes exams. It's also the likelihood that they've received support and the likelihood that they've received support recently that is affecting their performance. Children displayed a statistically significant increase in cortisol level in anticipation of high stakes testing. Large decreases and large increases in cortisol were associated with underperformance on the high stakes test. So ultimately, when we're using high stakes assessment, when we're using quantitative assessment, is the thing that we're measuring how stressed or anxious our students feel. High cortisol levels would be associated with anxiety. They'd be associated with stress. But this also points out that low cortisol levels are associated with low performance. Low cortisol levels, extremely low cortisol levels, would be associated with trauma and disassociation. Both of these things, trauma and also anxiety and stress, are something that so many of us and our students have been experiencing over the last 18 months, but something many of them were experiencing prior to the pandemic, and that went unnoticed in many cases. Grades are anathema to the presumption of the humanity of students, support for their basic needs, and engaging them as full participants in their own education. Invigilated exams won't ensure integrity. Plagiarism detection won't unseat online paper mills. Incessant surveillance won't help us listen better for the voices of students asking for help. Taking grades at least partly off the table means I have a whole different set of conversations with students I work with. My goal isn't to create a learning environment entirely free of grades. They still get graded in other classes, but to create a safe space for students to ask critical questions about grades, about how school works, and about their own learning. Ungrading starts with teachers just talking to students about grades. Demystifying grades and the culture around them gives students a sense of ownership over their own education. And I want to end here with two slides. One that introduces a couple alternative forms of assessment that I think are useful to think about. Things that I could go into depth later and will go into depth later in the full workshop that I'm doing as part of the series, the Big Questions Institute series. Minimal grading, using scales with fewer gradations to make grading simpler, fairer, clearer. This is an idea from Peter Elbow. Contract grading. Grading contracts convey expectations about what is required for each potential grade. Students work toward the grade they want to achieve, and goalposts don't unexpectedly shift. I think it's important to note here that we don't want to remove visible goalposts and replace them with invisible goalposts, because that will negatively affect the exact students that were already struggling, that were relying on those visible goalposts for some sense of what direction they need to work. Instead, what we need to do is question our own expectations and what the source of those expectations is. And instead, when we do have expectations, make them as visible as possible to students. Authentic assessment, having students write for real world audiences, focusing on intrinsic motivations and drawing students into the design of assignments, assessments. And finally, this is the one that I've spent most of my career doing, process letters. Asking students to reflect on their work and offer feedback on those reflections. Students help guide the grading of their own work. And as promised, I want to end with not best practices, but small things you can do tomorrow to start ungrading. And again, ungrading is not a series of practices, but a series of orientations towards the work of teaching. Number one, change how you think about assessment. Ungrading works best as part of a holistic pedagogical practice. Use words like ask or invite rather than submit or required. Ask students about their expectations for their work rather than centering your own. Invite students to a conversation about grades. Ask students how being graded makes them feel, how it affects their motivation. As a group, read and discuss a piece like Alfie Kohn's The Case Against Grades. Number three, grade less stuff, grade less often, grade more simply. Create space in your course for discovery and experimentation. Use a grading scale that feels less arbitrary and communicates more clearly to students. Ask students to do work that you don't collect. Peter Elbow writes about something that he calls a 0-point scale. So moving instead from a 93%, which feels arbitrary. Its only difference between a 91% is that it's more than a 91%. It is a mechanism of ranking. Moving to scales like a 3-point scale, which would be turned in, exemplary, needs improvement, or a 2-point scale, which would be turned in, needs revision, or a 1-point scale, which is turned in, not turned at all. But he also talks about a 0-point scale, which is asking students to do work that we don't collect, making a point to students that we aren't just receptacles for their work, that their work does work in the world and that their work does work for them. And that us as audiences is that we aren't in some ways the best audiences for their work, that they need to find ways to be audiences for their own work and to find authentic audiences. Ask students to reflect on their own learning. Even if you change nothing else about how you grade, ask students when and how they learn. Ask what barriers they face, listen, believe the answers. Thank you. I'm going to open it up to questions. Again, there's been a flurry of stuff in the chat, and I'm excited to find out some more of the questions that I've missed in the flurry.
Hey, Jesse, I'm back. I made it back to the office from the graduation party. This was great. I got to catch most of the webinar for the second time today. It was fantastic. There are a ton of questions coming through, and while we queue up some of those questions, we want to make sure that people know that we are going to get to do a bit more of a deep dive with Jesse, 2-day workshop, 2 hours a day, June 23rd and 25th, and we have it 2 hours a day at 2 different times each day because we have this incredible international community of people across time zones. So you can pick to take it at 11 a.m. or 7 p.m. Eastern time. And the bonus is if you register before June 16th, I don't know, midnight, June 16th, I guess we could say, we're going to take an additional 20% off. Use the code Ungrade20. So we want to just try to get as many people who want to be part of this in the room as possible, because we know the interest is really high. We want to remove as many barriers as we can. If you're a team, you can contact us at go to our bigquestions.institute website, contact us, let us know you have a team. We'll give you a price for a team from a school as well. And if you want to take How to Ungrade along with 4 other sessions, Will and I are Unleashing Fearless Inquiry, which has a lot to do with storytelling. Pam Moran and Ira Sokol are going to be presenting on timeless learning. Gary Stager and Sylvia Martinez are doing project-based learning with a great twist. And Jacinta Williams and Shelley Paul are going to be doing equity by design. So from June to September, we've got these great sessions, and you get 20% off when you register for the full series, all the sessions as well. So we think it's a good deal. We know there is so much learning. It's super stimulating. And I just have to say, you know, one thing for me that is really interesting, a question that's been kind of coming up throughout the chat, I'm going to kind of leave with this before we go to some other questions, is sort of this meta question on reflection. And, you know, it's like part of the process is for students to reflect, but how do you really teach reflection? I'm seeing a lot of people ask that question. How do you, you know, it's sort of been taught out of them. It's been sort of schooled. I think it's been schooled out of our kids. So how do we sort of help them to recenter so they can do productive reflection, honest, productive reflection?
Yeah, I use a lot of self-reflection and self-evaluation in my teaching, and people often, when they experiment it with the first time, or when they're wary about experimenting with it, they say, well, will students be able to do it right? And I think to myself, I don't necessarily know if self-reflection and evaluation is something that we do right. It's something that we learn how to do over time. It's something I'm still learning how to do in my mid-40s. It's something that my daughter is teaching me how to do all over again. So I think the expectation that students would get it right is not necessarily the right orientation or approach to that. Ultimately, I think self-reflection and self-evaluation, metacognition is something that we practice, and something that we get students to practice as early as possible. Getting them to think about and talk about their learning is such a useful task, whether they do it right or not. Just the act of practicing becomes useful. I think the same of self-evaluation. Ultimately, I think that we end up having to evaluate ourselves and our own competency and ability so many more times throughout our life than we are externally evaluated. And learning how to do that, learning how to have the confidence to do that, means fumbling and failing together with people. And I think the reason that we have institutions of education is so that we can do learning with other people. And ultimately being able to fumble alongside other people who will support us is what the work is. So I guess that ultimately I say, when people say, well, will students give themselves the right grade? I say, I don't necessarily know that whether or not they give themselves the right grade is the point. The point is that they have this activity and this exercise, and that's important.
Beautiful. Yeah.
There's a question, and actually this one kind of relates. There's a question that I saw in the chat. What strategies do you recommend for getting students on board with an unfamiliar system that inspires doubt and suspicion? And I think that the most important thing is that we remind students that a rug isn't going to get pulled out from under them. Students have had rugs pulled out from under them throughout so much of their educational career. They've been told they'll have agency and then found out that in fact they didn't have agency, that agency was being actively stripped from them. And so actively reminding students that a rug isn't going to get pulled out from under them. We're going to try something together. It might work, it might not. You might succeed. It might be a failure. That failure will be a learning process. We're going to do it together. And at no point am I going to pull a rug out from under you. And then I think the key is then to not pull a rug out from under them. And that's work. And that's sometimes extraordinarily challenging work.
Yeah, it's so interesting when trust is so tenuous and then you're saying, I'm okay with failure. It's a really interesting tension.
Yeah. And actually, sometimes people talk about valorizing failure. Ultimately, I think that what we need to valorize is practice. And that practice is the word that we should valorize. And I'm always a little bit like, the word failure has such deep connotations that I don't know how useful it is in practice to use the word failure, because it makes my shoulders tighten just hearing the word. But a word like practice, I think, is a word that has a lot of the same positive benefits or meaning, but not necessarily the negative connotations associated with it.
So Jesse, there was a question early on in the chat about labor-based grading, and you'd mentioned it too, that maybe you wanted to talk about it a little bit. I'm not sure this is the same thing, but it might be. I mean, I remember when I was teaching composition courses in high school for, upper school kids back in the late 20th century, way back when, I decided not to grade their writing, but we decided to kind of collaborate on a grade on their effort, on how much effort they put in terms of trying to improve different things, kind of moving out of the box. I'm not sure if that's the same thing, but
I think
maybe
similar.
You can talk about that. Yeah.
I think similar to some extent, but the one thing that I hear when I hear the word effort is I hear something that is also potentially arbitrary. How do you measure effort? What's 100 effort? What's 50 effort? What's 70 effort? It's a word that suggests some potentially invisible goalposts. So my mentor in thinking about labor-based grading, labor-based contract grading, is Asao B. Inui, and he writes about labor-based contract grading and also anti-racist assessment ecologies. And has a wonderful book with that title, Anti-Racist Assessment Ecologies. And ultimately, I think the thing that is useful about labor is that it isn't arbitrary. For an A, you will do X, Y, Z. For a B, you will do X, Y, Z. For a C, you will do X, Y, Z. So it isn't necessarily a contract in the sense that there's a legal contract. It is instead a sort of social contract, an agreement that if you do these things, you will get this grade. And it goes back to this idea of visible goalposts. In contract grading, the goalposts are as visible as they can possibly be. And I think one of the things that's useful about contract-based grading is that students don't always have the same expectations as we have as teachers. In some ways, we're the people who have been most successful in our educational system, which means we're also likely the people who are most influenced by its problematic hierarchies, et cetera. And so we're the people who have to do a lot of this critical work of raising our eyebrows at our own educations. we, because we've been so successful in this system, expect ourselves to get A's, and we expect all of our students to want A's. Not all of our students are in the same place. The great thing about contract grading is it gives students the ability to decide a B in this course is success for me. And it allows them to experience that as a success and not a deficit. And I think we need to give space for students to make those decisions for themselves. It's one of the reasons why I think I actually prefer pass-fail systems, because not everyone's measure of success is the same. I think there should be, I'm ready to move on, or I'm not ready to move on. And I think students should be partners in making those kinds of decisions.
Well, Jesse, listen, we want to be respectful of your time and the time of the people in the session. Thank you so much for doing this, both again twice today, both at noon and at 7 p.m. Both of these sessions were pretty amazing, and it's just so interesting when you start thinking about all the different ways that we could do this. Yet, you know, we really don't have a lot of conversations around maybe thinking differently. So. Really looking forward to the workshops. I know I'm going to be there, and hopefully folks on this call will decide to join us, because there's a lot to talk about here. There's no question. And again, we appreciate you coming along to do that as well in about 12 days from now.
Yeah,
So,
and ultimately, I'll say that this is work that we can't do on our own.
Right.
This is ultimately collaborative work. Teaching is collaborative work. Professional development is so necessary because we have to be students ourselves, and we have to find ourselves with like-minded teachers working through and struggling through so much of this. And I find that to be especially true in the wake of the last 18 months. We need other people doing this work alongside us.
Absolutely.
Jesse, thank you so much for reframing this conversation in terms of justice and relationships and trust. And you know, ultimately, I think what makes us human, not what makes us a number. You know, we're so much more than zeros and ones, or up to, you know, a scale of 100. It is incredibly refreshing, incredibly heartening, and I find very creative. This feels like a very creative process, and I'm very excited to learn more. And I can't wait for the 4-hour deep dive. This hour went really fast. So thank you again. And everybody who has tuned in from all over the world, and the incredible chat. All of us have to like go back and read it again and again. And then everybody that's here, go back and read the chat from 12 o'clock too, because that's also really, really strong, really powerful. So once again, thank you, everybody. This was great fun and just really mind-blowing.
Here's everyone. Stay well.
Thanks all.
Bye-bye.
Bye.